Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching us. This is the Grad Connection. I'm Jamie Moeller, and my goal here is to try to help you do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. Been a couple weeks since I posted a video, but I want to continue in this thread of the research series. And I've kind of been trying to chop off different pieces that seem to make sense as you kind of progress through your graduate studies. So what today I want to talk about are the different kinds of exams that can occur in graduate programs. And so I'm going to be speaking predominantly, obviously, from a Purdue perspective, because that's where I'm located at. But hopefully it'll give you some context, and it may actually give you some idea of things that you can, if you're at another institution, things that you can talk to your major professor, or look in some handbook to try to figure out what the exams are going to look like for you. But graduate exams are a significant element of graduate programs, and they're quite honestly very different than the kinds of things you might experience as an undergraduate type of exam. And I'll also say within each exam type, if you want to call it that, I've experienced being in the graduate school at Purdue, I've noticed there's a lot of variability from department to department as to what the exam might look like. So I would encourage, even if you're at Purdue and you're hearing me watching this video, I would encourage you to make sure that you kind of investigate what the culture is of your department, what the expectations and so forth are of your major professor. Because all of that's going to trump anything that I might say here. And so you're going to want to take a look at that and see. So this video is predominantly going to focus on qualifying exams, preliminary exams, proposal defenses, and then final defenses. The first two are really only going to apply if you're in a PhD program. The other two are going to apply whether you're in a master's program or a PhD program. And in all of this, I'm assuming that you're doing a research-based degree that requires either a thesis or a dissertation. So first and foremost, I guess to start this off, I want to talk about qualifying exams, preliminary exams. But the thing I have to talk about, and again, I'm using Purdue's language here. Other universities may mix these terms. They may make them synonymous. I don't know. But I at least can provide it from my perspective here, of having been an academic at Purdue. So to me, there are two types of PhD programs. Earlier video, I talked about different types of degree programs, like professional degrees versus research-oriented degrees versus all of that. So this is another layer to that onion, if you will. So when you're in a PhD program, there are two predominant types. One that I call a Master's Plus. And in a Master's Plus PhD program, you come in with an existing master's degree. And at least at Purdue, 30 credit hours of the courses from that master's degree can be applied to the 90 credit hours that are required for the PhD. That's the Master's Plus. Then there's a direct to PhD. The direct PhD is where you're coming directly out of a bachelor's program, and you're essentially doing 90 credit hours of work within that PhD program, right? So those are the two types of PhD programs. And the reason I make that distinction, the reason I say this is the direct PhD, you have a qualifying exam, usually about 1.5 years in to 2 years in. And then you have a preliminary exam that's usually at the end of your coursework. So that would, in a direct to PhD, that would be approximately, if it's a 6-year program, assuming a master's degree is 2 years, and a Master's Plus PhD is 4, that's 6 years. So it would basically be at the end of what years? Got to think about this. If it's 6 years, it'd be end of year 5. Sorry, I didn't do my math. I should have wrote it down. In a Master's Plus PhD, you don't have a qualifying exam in most cases. To me, it's like if you think about the Master's Plus is like you have 30 credit hours of Master's and then 60 for your PhD. Over on the direct to PhD, you have 90, but about 2 years in, you have the qualifying exam. You could say that the qualifying exam is kind of like the same type of hurdle that a thesis would be over here in the master's degree. They're not exactly equal, but that's how they match up. And depending on what field or discipline you are in, some fields have both a Master's Plus option and a direct to PhD option. Other fields may only have a direct to PhD option, and Usually, if a person ends up with a master's in that kind of field, it's seen as a consolation prize, like you didn't pass your qualifiers. So really is field dependent, but that's kind of the difference why the differentiation of qualifying exams versus preliminary exams. So first, let's start talking about a qualifying exam. So a qualifying exam can take different shapes, and this is the one where I think I've seen the most variability. But it's usually, at least in my perspective, usually the qualifying exam is a real exam that you would take, and it may be a series of exams that you take over a period of time. They usually cover like core content that might be in the beginning parts of that PhD. Might be quantitative research, it might be research methods, it might be some kind of theory particular to that discipline or whatever. So that's one form, and that's probably the most common form I've seen of qualifiers. Usually it's a pretty stiff gate, and it's a difficult thing to pass because it is a lot of head knowledge. It's basically certifying you to go on into your PhD and continue work. I kind of had the sense, but I'll be honest, I did the path of master's plus, right? So I had a master's degree, and then I did a 60 credit hour PhD over the top of it. Now, all PhDs are 90 credit hours, so I shouldn't say, I did 60. Total was 90, but the master's counts as 30 of that, right? So that's the qualifying exam. Again, key thing is to find out what the requirements are in your particular program. A policy that we have at Purdue, and this is part of the university regulations, is that when you come in as a beginning student, whatever policies are in place at the time of your admission, the time of your enrollment, the time you start your program, those are the rules that apply to you. And so if you happen to find yourself in a program, particularly at Purdue, but I'd say elsewhere, this reg probably exists elsewhere. If you find yourself in a degree program where you're constantly chasing, where the end goal is always changing, like somebody keeps changing the qualifying requirements or some kind of exam requirements or some kind of degree requirements, realize that's really against the university regulations, particularly at Purdue. And that's where you might want to come talk to one of us in the graduate school to make sure that we can help you get that bar from changing. Because the idea is when you start as a student, the institution makes a contract with you concerning the policies that are in place at the time that you enroll, right? So adding course requirements or adding new degree requirements or in those kinds a department can do that, right? But they cannot retroactively apply it. They can only apply it moving forward. Now, you as a student can opt into those new requirements, but there's a process for that. So just realize this is something that I recognize, having worked in the graduate school for some time. I hear this a lot from graduate students where their expectation is this, and then all of a sudden somebody adds some new requirement to them that wasn't in place when they started the degree program. And that is, totally against university regs at Purdue for sure. So that's qualifying exams. Preliminary examinations. Now, qualifiers could also have some presentation component, but in most cases, it's an examination of head knowledge, in my opinion. Now, that could be, it could be short answer questions, it could be essay, it could be anything, any kind of exam kind of approach as far as a written exam could be used, but it's usually some kind of exam. And quite honestly, I think the qualifying exam more mirrors what you would see in an undergraduate exam, right? A senior level exam, no less, but it would mirror that. Now, preliminary examination. Now, there's more consistency, I'll say, at least at Purdue, there's more consistency with preliminary examinations. The preliminary examination usually has two components. I'll describe what I find is the most common. But there's usually two components. There's a written component and there's an oral component. The written component usually has some time limit, might be as long as a month. And essentially you answer questions and you usually answer them outside of class. So it's like, you work on this outside of any time in a classroom. So it's not like you're bound to that. But the questions for that exam usually come from the committee. So at Purdue, when you have a preliminary exam committee, when you start as a PhD student, you only have 3 committee members. I think I've talked about this in one of the other videos. But you have 3 committee members. And after the preliminary examination, that's when you add a 4th committee member. So again, with preliminary examination, It's usually an at-home writing assignment over a period of time. It might be 2 weeks, it might be 5 weeks. Usually there's some kind of page limit wrapped around it so that you're not writing ad nauseum over that period, and so to also manage expectations. And so you have the writing component that with questions that are asked by different faculty. As you answer each one, you usually flow those to the faculty committee so that they can be reading them all along. And then there's also an oral component. And that oral component of a preliminary examination is typically you presenting your responses to those questions. And then also it gives the faculty committee the opportunity to ask additional questions. One of the things I would say is typically a preliminary examination might be a 2-hour meeting with the committee. I've seen some that are as short as an hour, some as long as 2 hours. But it really kind of depends upon, so I've kind of given you the overall structure, but one other thing that I haven't said is, now the way I run preliminary examinations is I typically will ask my graduate student for a prospectus or a proposal, the beginnings of what's going to be their dissertation work. And I give that to the committee before they answer questions, because my hope is that the questions that the committee asks actually help fill in any gaps or holes that are in the preliminary examination. Some other faculty will actually use the preliminary examination as a proposal defense proper, right? So this is one thing, to recognize and to find out from your major professor. Are you going to have a separate preliminary examination and proposal defense, or are they kind of wrapped into one? That's one question. Second question would be, what are the expectations for a preliminary examination? The best scenario, in my opinion, is where the chair of the committee garners the questions from the various committee members, assembles it in a single one-pager, if you will, and they give that to the student to begin the writing period for the preliminary examination, the out-of-class writing examination. I think there are faculty that take the approach of you as a student have to go around to each faculty member and garner questions. I don't like that approach because it puts a student in a difficult position, particularly if you get 2 questions from 2 different faculty members that are asking the same thing. Because you really don't want to take any liberties. This is where I think my expectations of a chair may be out of whack. I don't know, but this is where I would expect the chair to kind of give some guidance and direction. So that's the preliminary examination. Let's go on and talk about proposal defense. Now, again, with master's degrees, you almost always have a proposal defense, or at least that's been my experience. Again, with PhDs, you may or may not have a proposal defense. It depends upon how the prelim goes. So I've described how I do the prelim, which means after the preliminary examination, I have the student go back and take those answers that they've provided for the preliminary examination and weave them into the proposal. And we have one final proposal meeting with the committee. I think this sets the student up for the best amount of success because they kind of have every committee member in the room eyeball to eyeball, and they get agreement, and they can set expectations and all that kind of stuff. I'm aware that some faculty's process is, to send the student around to each committee member. They write their proposal, send it to each committee member, and then they meet with each of them to get their feedback. The problem with that is oftentimes you get conflicting feedback, and it puts a student in a difficult position of trying to rectify that and try to figure out, because faculty member A will give you one thing, faculty member B will tell you an opposite thing to that, and then number C will give you one other thing, and you get into this problem where you can't get agreement and you're running around with individual meetings to try to get that, when a single meeting would accomplish that. So proposal defenses for master's students, I would encourage always having a proposal defense. Proposal defense for a master's degree, typically it's about a 30-minute presentation with maybe 15 minutes. It's usually an hour in total. For PhD students, it may be an hour and a half, in which the proposal defense, the presentation piece of it may be 45 minutes with cuss and discuss with the faculty members for the remainder of that time. But I would encourage, and I've also heard another practice that I've heard, and usually one of the things that people ask, and I guess I didn't mention this, again, qualifiers are usually in year 2 of a direct PhD, because a direct PhD is going to be 6 years, so it's in year 2. For a master's plus PhD, typically because you've already got 2 years under your belt because of the master's degree, the preliminary examination is usually in year 4, and in a direct PhD, it's usually in year 5, right? And then the proposal defense is usually I typically have it not long after the preliminary examination. There are some people that advocate, well, do all this work relative to your research and then have a quick proposal meeting. In other words, it's basically you basically get approval on the topic ex post facto. That is, after you've done all the work. I think that's risky. There are fields that do that. So again, talk to your major professor, find out what the culture is in your department and what the approach is. I don't necessarily care for that approach because it can be dangerous for the student. And then the last thing would be final defenses. The final defenses are usually scheduled for an hour and a half. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll last that long. Typically, I'll say at Purdue, the final thesis, if you're talking about a master's student, or the final dissertation for a PhD student, typically that has to be provided to the committee 2 weeks in advance of the scheduled date. For the actual dissertation or thesis defense, student presents, and then there's Q&A afterwards to follow. And so that's kind of how those are typically structured. Most universities have rules about, like Purdue has a latest date for you to be able to deposit your thesis or dissertation, and a latest date for being able to do examinations. So key for you as a PhD student at Purdue particularly is to reverse engineer from the dates that are in the graduate school calendar, as far as you want to reverse engineer from whatever the latest date is to deposit to figure out when you need to defend, and then to backfill from defense 2 weeks before that, knowing that you have to have your 100% thesis or dissertation submitted to the committee by that, and then 2 weeks before that has to be the scheduling of the meeting. So and I would say if you're at Purdue, if I can help in any of this in any way and trying to help finalize or plan these things with you, if you need some additional assistance, I'm more than willing to do that. So that kind of gives you the lay of the land. Hopefully this is helpful. It's one of the details that I think sometimes is left to the student to figure out, and sometimes it's well documented in some departments, and in other departments it's not. Sometimes there may be additional faculty expectations that you have to deal with. So key is having conversations about these exams well in advance so that you know what to expect and how to approach it. So with that, again, I'm Jamie Moeller. This is the Grad Connection, and I appreciate comments and feedback that people have given me. Hopefully you find this useful. Please share it with folks that you are peers with as far as graduate students. I'm always interested to see the wide range of people that continue to watch the content and access the information, so I hope it's helpful. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.